we start recording now? Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today on this webinar, part of the series of the INEE Advocacy Working Group of webinars on advocacy for education in emergencies. Today we'll be talking about advocacy for education for refugees, covering local, national and global case studies. Just a few points on housekeeping for the webinar. If we could go to the next slide. All the microphones are currently on mute. You will have a chance to ask questions, particularly at the end. If you have questions in the meantime, please post them in the chat and we will try and get around to them. And as I say, at the end of the presentations, you'll have a chance to have a verbal communication as well. The session is being recorded, so for anyone who couldn't make it now for the live webinar, please let them know that they can watch it later on. Okay, so let me introduce you to our presenters. We are very grateful to Mercy, Emma, Fonny, Jennifer, and Edmund Langat for presenting today, and I'm Edmund Page, the moderator for today's webinar. The presenters will not be giving rigidly back-to-back presentations throughout the webinar. Rather, their contributions will be interspersed throughout the webinar. Jennifer and Emma are going to give some global context to the refugee education situation around the world, a bit of an introduction, as well as focusing on some campaigns that have overlapped global advocacy efforts, such as high-level meetings and conferences with national-level advocacy for refugee education. They'll also be talking about the Global Refugee Forum, which in many ways brings together these campaigns into one united forum on advocacy, which has education as a key theme. Mercy Msembi and Edmund Langat will be then talking about a local advocacy effort in Kenya, and Fonny will be talking about her work through the Global Youth Advisory Council and focusing partly on the tertiary education advocacy for refugees that they've been doing. So without further ado, let me hand over to Jennifer to start the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmund, and welcome to everybody. I thought we could start by just setting the scene with the current figures about refugee education, really as a reminder to everybody about why there is still such a need for advocacy around this issue, and the fact that although progress has been made, we still have a really long way to go in ensuring that all refugees have access to quality education. So when we look at the global statistics, I mean, one of the first and most striking things is that 3.7 million refugee children are out of school. And this is really a significant number when we look at the targets in terms of meeting the SDG 4 goals. And we also know that enrollment drops very sharply from 63% for primary to just 24% for those who are of secondary school age. And so refugee girls and boys, or who are adolescents, have a much lower chance of being in school than their host country peers. And this is significant when we think about the skills and the knowledge and the qualifications needed to succeed as adults and to break out of a cycle of poverty. In terms of the numbers, more than 60% of refugees are under 18 in several countries. And so the percentage of people that need support and need access to education is very large. And we also know that 4 out of 5 refugees are living in protracted situations. These are situations that are lasting for more than 5 years. And so if you think of that in educational terms, that's a significant amount of time in terms of a child's education cycle. Next slide, please. And we also know that many refugees are hosted in countries that are the poorest in the world, and where access to education is already severely limited. So host country populations struggle to have access alongside refugees. It's not limited to the one group. Which brings us to the next point, that when we are looking at how to respond, one of the key issues that we'll be talking about today, and the key shifts that we see in the world, is that we cannot consider the needs of refugees separately from those of the host communities. That we are not looking at interventions that only focus on one group, and especially as more and more refugees live in urban areas and are interspersed with their host communities, we cannot see their needs and the difficulties they face in accessing education as being separate from those of the host community. The next slide, please. So I just want to introduce and make reference to the Global Compact on Refugees, particularly in relation to the work that's done on advocacy. I think many of you know that the Global Compact was endorsed by 181 countries. And so this represents a huge amount of political will that is being dedicated to the issue of refugees. And education receives a few paragraphs in the Global Compact and very specific mention. And in the next slide, I will put up some of the key points that are made about education. But the Global Compact really is a unique opportunity for advocacy, because not only does it represent this coming together and coalition of political will, but it's also really about a change in emphasis in how we respond to refugee situations, moving from positions where states or the UN or international bodies are seen as having a primary responsibility for responding and supporting the responses, but really to looking at a whole of society approach, bringing in all actors, and that this is about shared responsibility and the shared responsibility of the international community to respond to these situations. But also the Global Compact, and this is one area that we see that is quite different to some of the other conventions that exist, is that there's a very clear linking with the needs of host communities and recognizing the impact of situations on hosting communities and the fact that international solidarity efforts and advocacy needs to take into account the needs of both groups. The Global Compact speaks to issues of access to education at all levels. And so in this way, the references to education are also very closely aligned with what appears in SDG 4. And there's not only looking at access, but also at quality and the quality of education for all, so that we are moving beyond simply looking at numbers but actually the quality of outcomes achieved and the quality of the educational experiences. Have the next slide. Thank you. So these are some of the key messages for those who wish to look at the compact about what is being said. And so one of the key messages is really around inclusion in national systems and minimizing the amount of time that children spend out of school. That within the first 3 months of displacement, we want to see children going back into education and back into school. And that it's very important that, and we're looking at a process of system strengthening, whereby there's an emphasis on inclusion in national schools right from the start of a response. As I mentioned, there's also a reference to the inclusion of refugees in sector plans, so that we are taking a long-term view to the response, not just looking at short-term immediate responses when an emergency happens, but really looking at how to make that response sustainable. So I'm going to pause there and hand over to Emma, who can speak more about some of the processes that led up to the adoption and the campaigns that existed around that.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Hi everyone, it's really lovely to be speaking with you. Before I talk about Save the Children's campaigning on refugee education, I just wanted to give a little overview of some of the timeline of some major moments, global moments on education for refugees, just to give a bit of an overview, as it can be a bit confusing to follow all the different agreements that happened. So the first one was in 2016. It's called the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants. And that again was a global agreement made at the UN General Assembly that year. And it talked about how to just transform the way the world responds to refugee movements and how to best support host communities as well. And there's a number of education commitments in that we work to influence. Then obviously from 2016, or 2017 to 2018, the Global Compact on Refugees was negotiated. And this was actually part of what was in the New York Declaration itself. It said that we should create a global compact on refugees to really get into much more detail about how we respond to refugee movements. So there was about a year of time when the compact was being negotiated, and there were lots of moments then that a number of actors were looking to influence that compact. In September of 2018, we held a high-level event on action for refugee education, which is one of the things I'll come on to shortly. And of December that year, the Global Compact was actually formally agreed and endorsed, and as Jennifer said, endorsed by over 180 countries. And then the last thing that we're coming to today in the presentation is the Global Refugee Forum, which is in December this year, which has education as a key theme. And this is when a range of stakeholders will come together to agree to announce pledges and contributions and share good practice around responding to refugees. So that's kind of the overview of some key moments over the last few years. And now I'm going to go into a bit of discussion about Save the Children's activity. Great. So we had a campaign called Every Last Child, which has focused on education for refugees since 2016. And it's a global campaign. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So it's a global campaign, but it also has a number of activities at country level as well. So we had some very ambitious visions and goals, as you can see here, but they try to really focus on which things we really wanted to have action on. So obviously we had an overall vision of where we wanted to see, to have refugee children from ages 0 to 18 having access to quality learning opportunities. And that was our overall advocacy objective. And then we had a number of goals, again at the global level, but could then be used nationally as well, around increasing access for refugee education, improving the quality of education that all refugees receive, and also focus on early years, because we think that was such a crucial moment in young children's lives to get a really good start. So we had a goal around that as well. And as I said, we had lots of activity at the global level, which I'm going to come on to shortly, but we also supported a number of countries and our country offices and colleagues in those offices to do advocacy at the national level. And some of those countries are listed here. They were Lebanon, Jordan, Uganda, Thailand, Bangladesh, and Turkey. And some of the times we would work regionally, if there was, there's been these annual Supporting Syria and the Region conferences for a number of years, and we've been supporting our country offices and regional offices in the Syria region with advocacy at those moments, but also supporting countries like Uganda when they had a refugee solidarity conference, and we made sure that we supported that country office to write reports, to engage with the government, to offer advice and expertise that they needed. And the focus of our campaign was achieved through 4 main pillars, which are listed along the bottom of the slide here. The first is around inclusion, which is about including refugees in the national education system. The second improvement is about improving the quality of education that refugees receive. And the third one is investment, making sure that we fill the financing gap so that we actually funding access and quality education. And the last is accountability. This is such an important one because a lot of member states and organisations, we make a number of commitments and promises, but we need to hold those actors to account for actually delivering on those promises that they made. So these main pillars were we used them throughout the campaign to really help frame what our messaging, activities and campaigning was all about. Next slide, please. So we had a lot of activities. Obviously, we've been running this campaign since 2016, and we had a number of lots of different activities, but I'm just highlighting a few in this presentation today. The first one was the work that we did to influence the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants in 2016. We knew that this agreement was going to be made, and we wanted to make sure it was strong as possible and included education as a key focus, that ensured that education was actually included in the agreement and not left off, And we also wanted to ensure that there was some record or a language around the length of time that refugees should be without education, reducing the amount of time that refugees are out of education. So we actually made a call with a number of other NGOs to ask for refugees to be included in the national, or having some education within 30 days of their displacement. And we did that by writing briefings, meeting with a lot of member states, officials mainly, but also some ministers who were negotiating the agreement, and getting a number of member states on side with us who would then advocate in support of our call. And in the end, the final agreement that was made was that refugees should have a quality education within a few months of displacement. So not quite the 30 days that we were looking for, but I think it's still really important to have that length, that timeline within the language of the declaration, so that we have a target to be working towards. And as part of the activities that we did around the declaration was having a side event at the UN General Assembly. And we had a young refugee girl, Lana, who's from Syria and currently living in Jordan, who spoke directly to the UN Secretary General about what she thinks about education, how important it is to her, and some of the challenges she was facing. So I think that was really important to have a refugee who's experienced some of the challenges, getting a good education, actually speaking directly to decision makers. Great, so that's the next slide, please. So this next kind of highlight that I wanted to discuss with you was a high-level meeting on action for refugee education. And this was held in the UN General Assembly at 2018. So it was about halfway through the negotiations of the Global Compact itself. And it was about bringing together as many stakeholders as possible to raise awareness about the challenges that refugees and host communities face getting a good education, to highlight the importance of the Global Compact, and to start thinking about how to actually deliver action to meet the Global Compact. So we co-hosted the event with UNHCR, and then we were able to bring on a number of other co-hosts as well who were so interested in it. And I think you can see the range of different co-hosts here, a number of member states, UN agencies, financial institutions, and I think that really shows the number of organisations and member states who are so interested in this issue. And it really made it a really credible event that lots of people were interested in. UN General Assemblies can be a very, very crowded space, so trying to get any attention on an issue during that time is particularly difficult. So trying to get lots of member states and co-hosts interested in it was a really important part of our strategy. Next slide, please. So what actually happened at the event itself? I guess we have a number of events that we hold, and sometimes we might think, what is actually achieved at them? Are they actually leading to some concrete outcomes? So I would say that what we did was that we tried to bring in more support for the Global Compact by creating this, what we called a Charter for Action. And this basically was not a legally binding document, but all it said was, we support the Global Compact and we want to turn it into action. And we had a number of endorsements for that charter. It basically reiterated a number of agreements already made, but kind of held them to account to meeting those agreements again. We also asked for organisations and states to send in their case studies so that we could learn from them and share them with others. And we had 31 case studies come in. And we also asked for organisations and states to start thinking about how they were actually going to turn the Global Compact, that agreement, into action. And as Jennifer mentioned, there are 2 paragraphs in the Global Compact with a number of different recommendations and commitments on education, but we really wanted to see that turned into action. So we did quite a lot of work to get organisations to make some concrete commitments at that stage, which is kind of start of the process that leads towards the Global Refugee Forum this year. We also had a lot of people in the room and lots of people also joining a live stream as well. So all this work was beginning to raise awareness of a need for a global plan of action on refugee education, and start people thinking about the Global Forum, which is happening in a few months now, to keep building the awareness and interest in education for refugees at the global level. And there's a web page along the bottom of the slide. You can still see the live stream of the event, the case studies, who endorsed the Charter for Action, and then some other videos as well. So I would definitely recommend having a look there for lots of different interesting content. Okay, I think I'm now passing on to Mercy, I think. Is that right? Yes. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks very much for that, Emma. This next part of the presentation is going to give a tangible example of one of those types of case studies, the presenters giving an account of their experience of doing some local level advocacy for education in Kenya. So perhaps Edmund Langat, if you could have a go at starting on this part, and Mercy can come in if she gets her connection.
Sure. Let's go to the next slide. All right. As mentioned by Edmund, we're going to talk about the advocacy process on what we did towards having, refugees included into accessing public primary schools in Kenya. The background of the process basically was there are no existing guidelines on refugee admission into public schools in Kenya. And as such, XAVIER project being UNHCR implementing partner in urban centers, used to co-chairs the education working group with UNHCR. And through this deliberation within the education working group, we realized that there were major gaps limiting refugees and asylum seekers from accessing education in urban centers. So from this engagement with other organizations as well, we decided to try and engage the government into establishing an admission policy. Next slide, please. All right. Speaking of how we got the Ministry of Education officials' attention is that in partnership with the Ministry of Education, the Education Working Group carried out a joint immersive field visit to 3 refugee hosting areas in Kenya. That is in Nairobi, Nakuru, and Dadaab refugee camp. These visits were mainly to expose the education officials into the kind of challenges refugees do face in accessing education in the different parts of the country. And the idea behind that was also for the ministry officials to be able to identify the number of refugees who have already been enrolled in Kenyan public primary schools in all those particular areas, as well as also to look at that particular space in terms of the challenges also teachers as well as refugees and asylum seekers do face. And also this experience actually was the tipping point of the whole process, because through this particular one, that's where ministry official decided, or rather started developing ownership of the whole process itself. In terms of even the data collection itself, the ministry of officials were on top of things in terms of asking questions, developing the questionnaires, and even data analysis itself. Next slide, please. All right, when you talk about the implementation guidelines, we had a series of meetings afterwards with the ministry officials in terms of trying to analyze the data further, and also do a validation workshop in terms of deciding, or rather looking at the data that had been collected and the first draft of the guidelines themselves. Through this process, we were able to iron out all the issues and queries which the government had, because mostly in Kenya with refugees, the government is normally apprehensive when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers. And if you know the history of Kenya and refugees, you'll find that a couple of times the government has threatened to repatriate all refugees living in Kenya back to Somalia and the other countries. So this particular time, it was a good process, or rather a good opportunity for us to iron out all the contentious issues that the government official felt that they may have had. And through that, we were able to come up with a good document, the guidelines that is, whereby within the education working group and the Ministry of Education official were able to agree on. But from there on, it was the government now, that is the ministry, that took up that particular draft and ran with it. in such that they were able to have internal meetings among themselves in order to try and get some sign-off from other senior members of the ministry. And at some point, we had a key person within the ministry who was helping us drive this particular process. So that particular person ended up presenting the guidelines to senior ministry officials. That includes the Minister of Education as well as the Permanent Secretary of Education. And it's through that process that the guidelines were approved through an internal ministry memo. And the implementation directions were shared, or rather cascaded down from the central government to the county governments, Ministry of Education directors and officers in those particular different levels of governments. Next slide. Why did the process succeed? In this scenario, we look at the role of the Education Working Group and the role of the Ministry of Education itself. Speaking of the Education Working Group, the Education Working Group, if I may give a little background of the working group itself, is made up of different local and international organizations that implement education projects in Kenya. Now, with this Education Working Group is where all the members often come together to discuss issues affecting access to education among refugees and asylum seekers in Kenya, and also come up with joint projects, or also come up with activities whereby they can also contribute together. So the ownership and also the closeness of the Education Working Group made the process a success. Secondly, members of the Education Working Group shared a common goal and were committed to the whole process. Each and every member of the Education Working Group do implement on their own right access to education projects within urban centers as well as in the camps. So each one of them was a shareholder and a stakeholder for the whole process, and they had encountered similar challenges. So this one here brought them together, and they had a shared and common goal which they wanted to achieve at the end of the day. And most importantly, the Education Working Group sponsored the whole process, meaning starting from the data collection and the trips for the ministry officials around Nairobi, Nakuru, and the Dadaab refugee camp. And as I'm sure many of you do know, that doesn't come cheap. So all this was made possible because of the commitment the members had. And also knowing very well that the government often, is often a little bit apprehensive when it comes to these matters, and anything that makes the government contribute funding to it's normally a problem. And in many times, you never get to hear government contributing funds towards such an exercise. And also, more importantly, the continuous flow of information and communication with ministry officials. We ensured that we kept officials at the ministry on their toes, as well as very close, in such that we held continuous meetings together just to appraise ourselves on where we are on the whole process. And on the Ministry of Education side, we ensured that the Ministry of Education officials bought into the whole idea. We ensured that they owned the process, meaning that we encouraged them to take lead of the whole process from the start to the end. So the function that we were providing in that process looked more of like a supporting role compared to the actual function that we did from the beginning to the end. Next slide. Today, the admission guidelines are currently being implemented, as much as the process is still a little bit slow, but it's slow and steady. And it's really gaining traction across the country. You'll find that many areas whereby we used to experience challenges of refugees accessing education in public schools, things are slowly changing on the particular end. Teachers, headmasters, and principals in various government schools are more open towards receiving refugees to their institutions, which has really helped when it comes to access to education. And mind you, in Kenyan primary school, education is free for anyone residing in Kenya. But initially, prior to the admission guidelines coming in, you'll find that refugees used to be asked to pay some little fee in order to be able to access education, which was quite expensive considering the status of these particular persons of concern. And also you realize that in most cases nowadays, in fact, you'll find that teachers, they're actually more interested in learning a lot about refugees and how they can help them even better to be able to access education. And that's where you find that the XAVIER project continuously and frequently receives calls from teachers from various schools, the ones we've built rapport with, who keep on asking us questions, which has led us to doing some training, teacher training for refugees and teachers as well, and parents in some cases. Next slide. That's the end of my presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Edmund. And Mercy didn't have a chance to contribute to that because of connection issues, but she is going to still be available during the Q&A session to add her insights as well. But we're now going to move on to Fonny Joyce and her presentation on the Global Youth Advisory Council. Thank you, Fonny.
Thank you, Ed. I'll apologize beforehand before I start my presentation. It's a bit windy, so forgive me if you can hear the background noise. I'll start by just giving a brief background. Like just as Ed has said, my name is Fonny Joyce. I'm originally from South Sudan, but I'm based in Nairobi. The UNHCR Global Youth Advisory Council. Sorry, Ed. The next slide. Yes, I'll go over a brief background of the Global Advisory Council. The council in itself was initiated in 2017, and this was after a process of engaging with young people from different parts of the world and different countries. So during this process, we had a chance to engage with young people and really ask them what is it that as young people they feel that is much more important. From that, we came up with 10 challenges that were very constant, education being at the top of the list. And from that, we came up with the 7 core actions for refugee youth. These were now the recommendations that we gave on how to engage and work with young people. Next slide. I think the next one, please. Sorry, next slide. Oh, yes. The Global Youth Advisory Council, we've been doing different sorts of advocacy. We constitute of different members who are from different parts of the world, and most of them are refugees in countries of asylum, and others are also refugees in countries of resettlement. So we all do different activities depending on the country we represent or where we come from. What we also do is that we really consult with the community to see that what do they feel is the most important and pressing thing for them. So from there, that's when we draw the recommendations from the community and take it to the global level. Personally, I've been engaged with advocacy, especially in education, for about 3 years. I believe that education is a direct link between finding lasting solutions in our countries of asylum. My first encounter with advocacy in regards to education took part when I was a beneficiary of the Duffy Scholarship. We worked together with the Windle International Kenya to advocate on how do we ensure that young people, especially young refugees, are able to actually attend school without being limited. So what we did, when you join campus, you're required to actually pay a certain percentage. So we worked together with Windle just to see how do we sign MOUs with different universities to ensure that as a refugee, you're able to actually join campus without having a lot of levies that will maybe hinder your participation. The other way is we've tried to do advocacy is having bilateral meetings with states. So whenever we're in a global space with different members or different states, we set up meetings with the particular people so that we can ensure that we approach the issue at hand at different angles, because you can speak about it, but then when you go through the back route, I believe, you also have the opportunity to engage with the different states and show them why do we feel education is important. Because we all understand education is important, but sometimes people kind of seem to forget and they focus the energy in something different. In the lead up to the GRF, what we also have done as the Global Youth Advisory Council, we are co-sponsoring the theme education, because we feel it's a key component if we're to implement the GCR or the CRF. What we're also doing is to ensure that we want to ensure that any state that is pledging is able to actually pledge in the guidelines of ensuring that when they're talking about education, this is what we need when it comes to education. So for that, we've also developed a tip sheet as a way of guiding people who would pledge under education. We are also part of a tertiary refugee student network, which was just set up this year. Sorry, it's very windy. The Tertiary Refugee Student Network was set up this year in Berlin, and this network has different students from different parts, from different programs. We have DAFI and also other programs. So this network has both alumni and also current students in the different programs. The aim of the network is to ensure that we continue advocating for tertiary education to achieve the 15% by 2030. So what we're also doing with this particular network is that we've gone back to the different countries where these students are, and we're engaging with them to ensure that they engage with other existing networks within the countries where they come from. So when it comes to the GRF, we're hoping to actually just showcase good practices of how you can actually support education and how you can work together with different existing networks, and not just the traditional stakeholders, but also how you can work with other refugee-led organizations that are doing something in regards to education. So with the network itself, we're also just trying to support the students who are alumni and students who are not yet who have not yet actually attained that particular scholarship. So we're making sure that we coordinate all the different efforts, because we really want to, when we're talking about a whole of society approach, we're looking at it as refugees not just being beneficiaries of the particular services being offered, but also being a solution to the services that that should be offered. What we're also doing, that we're planning to do a couple of trainings, because we feel that during the Global Refugee Youth Consultation, what we found out was that we can't entirely separate education and leave out protection capacity or health and all that. They're kind of interconnected. So what we're also really trying to do is to show people that we need to really, when we're working on education, we also have to think about the psychological needs of the young people. We need to think about how they actually access health services. We need to think about how the documentation, how do we actually, when they have these particular documents from the different countries they're from, how do we ensure that their documents can be interpreted in that particular country? So for us, we're also really keen on working with the different stakeholders and showing them how do you engage with young people when it comes to advocacy, because we believe that it's very important to have us, the young people, us, the refugees, as part of the solution rather than looking for solutions for the refugees. So that for us has been very keen. And personally, I feel that when it comes to advocacy, it's very different when some audiences will accept having refugees in that particular spaces, but some audiences feel like they would want to really make that decision and say, we think this would work best. But what I've seen over the years of interacting with different audiences is that when you have the voices of refugees in the theme that is being advocated on, especially education, then you're able to get more you're able to get more concrete solutions, because they're the people who are living these experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fonny, and I completely agree. I think it's great that all the work that you're doing through the youth, the GYAC, and possibly through this webinar, more people can know about the work you're doing, can even reach out to you through the work you're doing to represent refugee voices, particularly for youth in this area. And now handing back over to Emma and Jennifer to wrap up and link these themes together.
Thanks very much. Thank you both to Fonny and to Edmund for your very practical examples that you've shared with us. What I'll be doing is going back to the global level and looking at how do we link the global and the local. So how do we have efforts at the global level that really will support and make the local advocacy more effective? So I'd just like to draw your attention to the refugee education strategy that was released earlier this year in August. This is a refugee education strategy that was put together after a lot of broad-based consultation with a lot of different actors and organizations all around the world to really be asking the question about what do we need to do in order to achieve the goal of refugee inclusion in education, and not just in any form of education, but particularly in schools, in the national schools, in accredited forms of education, so that people have education that holds currency. And the intention of issuing this document is not that it is a UNHCR strategy document that will just guide our actions as an organization, but that it is a broad-based strategy, that it is something that all organizations working in the field of refugee education can refer to, and to provide some common goals, some common platforms for action across all organizations, so that it's not limited to one or two actors. And so we would then suggest that organizations are able to refer to that when they do advocacy at the local level with governments, with other actors. That Edmund has spoken about the working group in Kenya, and so that where education working groups exist, this document can also serve as a reference document and a framework for setting a sector strategy with the government, with other actors, so that there is a level of commonality and agreement, and that this can serve as an example of what is possible. So just to have the next slide, please. Here, just also referring to some work that was done in East Africa, with using and illustrating how something like the Global Compact on refugees and the comprehensive refugee response framework, how that can be a catalyst for action at the local level. So following the declaration, the issuing of the New York Declaration, there were organizations that came on board, and countries that particularly that came on board to adopt a comprehensive refugee response framework. So this is really a platform for action at the country level, where particularly governments come together, bringing their ministries together, but also all the other actors involved in refugee response services, to say, this is the approach that we will take, and to have a common strategy. And Ethiopia, as one country, for example, made a commitment as part of the CRRF, then they were one of the countries to pilot this approach, made a commitment to increasing enrollment of refugees. These discussions around the CRRF actually became a platform for engagement with IGAD, the regional body, and which, through discussions on education, and particularly education for refugees, and looking at a comprehensive approach that looked at a region, especially where there were movement of refugees within the region, that led to the Djibouti Declaration, which has a number of commitments around education, and particularly inclusion in national systems. So those were local and regional efforts around advocacy. But where does the global come in? What helps then is having the global frameworks. UNHCR has negotiated global MOUs with the Global Partnership for Education and also the World Bank. And so once these declarations and the CRF was adopted and initiated in countries, it was possible then to leverage these global MOUs to leverage funds, to be able to implement programs, to be able to make the commitments that are made at a political level into a reality. Because without resources and without having the frameworks, be they at a regional or a global level, to resource commitments, these commitments just stay words and stay unimplemented. And I think we all know and have experienced where that has happened, where there's a goodwill, but the resources are lacking. And so this is one example where you have an interplay between agreements agreed at a global level and how they support, and that they're able to facilitate and give the means to be able to support local advocacy and the implementation of that advocacy. So I'll move to the next slide. So we were also asked, and the organizers asked us to reflect on some lessons learned in these various processes and in UNHCR's work more globally in terms of advocacy. And maybe just to give 3 key messages. The first one is persistence, and I think Edmund alluded to that in his presentation, is that there is a need that these processes don't take place quickly. They don't take place in a vacuum. And so there's a need for constant, regular engagement. And I think one of the keys that Edmund referred to in the presentation was the work of the Education Working Group, and the fact that multiple stakeholders coalesced around a single message and could keep reinforcing that message and giving that message in a persistent manner. And to be able to not be disheartened when change is not seen quickly, but to be able to be consistent and persistent. And this comes to the next point on patience, that often policy changes and often having really meaningful systems change, often government systems are relatively slow to adapt. And so there needs to be patience, and that this is a gradual process. And finally, the last point is to talk about political acumen, that often the success of advocacy is influenced very strongly by national political discourse at a particular point in time. And it's important to identify where are the points of influence within government, and maybe those are not always within the Ministry of Education, and how can different actors be brought to bear. So in the interest of time, I'm going to just pause there and hand back to Emma.
Thanks, Jennifer. So the next few slides are going to be focused on the Global Refugee Forum and the advocacy opportunities around the forum. So just to recap, this is something that is born out of the Global Compact on Refugees. Within that agreement, it says that there must be a Global Refugee Forum starting, the first one ever to start in 2019, and then on a 4-year basis. And really the purpose of these forums is to well, twofold. The first one is mainly twofold, which is to encourage a wide range of stakeholders, from refugee hosting states, donors, non-governmental organisations, private sector, many others, to come together and deliver pledges and contributions that will advance the objectives of the Global Compact, so that we really turn the words in the Global Compact into real action. And the second objective for this forum is also to highlight key achievements and exchange good practices, so that we can learn what really works well and how can we scale up or replicate those good practices in other places. And I would say that for this forum, these are the 2 main purposes, but I would say for the following forums, we will really be looking to kind of use them as accountability moments as well, to see how far we've progressed since the previous forum, to see, you know, how many more refugees are in school, what kind of education they're receiving, what are their learning outcomes. And so the first ever forum is happening in December this year in Geneva on the 17th to the 18th of December, with a civil society day on the 16th. And education is one of the key areas of focus, one of 6 areas. And there is a co-sponsorship alliance that has come behind the education theme. And presently there are 51 organisations, states, UN agencies and financial institutions that have all signed up to be an education co-sponsor. I think it's actually the largest co-sponsorship alliance compared to the other themes, and it also has the most states involved as well. I think there are about 10 states who have signed up to be education co-sponsors. And what it means to be a co-sponsor is that you are using your expertise and your energy to mobilise your own pledges for the forum, but also to advocate to others to bring in more support for education at the forum itself. And part of the work that the Co-Sponsorship Alliance has been doing is to develop a global framework for refugee education. So I'll come on to that in a moment, and then you might see that at the bottom of the screen, the next few slides, there are some actions that you might want to think about for your own organisations and your own work. So you may want to join up as an education co-sponsor yourself. Your organisation might like to, and you can see where to go for more information on the Global Refugee Forum website. You may also want to think about the kinds of pledges you can make, and also you know, what advocacy you can do in your own context. So on to the next slide. So one of the things that the co-sponsorship group is developing is a global framework on refugee education. So why is this framework needed? So I think one of the worries that we have around the Global Refugee Forum, and I guess this is the case for many kinds of pledging moments and conferences, as there are many for different crises or different priority challenges, is that sometimes pledges might not be that concrete or measurable, and they might not actually deliver what's actually needed on the ground. So we could be in a situation where lots of different organisations make random pledges at the forum which don't really deliver on the needs. And so we really wanted to come together with UNHCR and lots of other partners and all the different co-sponsorship alliance members to develop a framework to try and crowd in pledges in the most meaningful way possible. And so this way we've kind of setting out, it's kind of a pledging framework, and it includes 3 main outcome areas. So it has one theme around inclusion, which has a focus on early childhood development, primary and secondary, looking really at how do we include refugees in the formal education system. The second is around tertiary, and the last is around education emergencies. So ensuring that the initial response to a refugee crisis really delivers and improves the system on the more longer term. And again, there's some more actions for you. So this actual framework will be published in early to mid-November. It's just being finalised at the moment. And I think this is a really crucial document that you can use to assess what are the education needs for refugees and host communities in your context. And also, how can you use this to advocate to your government to make pledges, or within your own organisation to make pledges that help to try and meet those needs. On to the next slide. So I just wanted to give a bit of an example of how the pledging actually works, because I think it can be a little bit confusing. And I want to make sure that you all understand that the pledges don't have to be just financial. Pledges can cover a wide kind of variety of things. They can, of course, be financial, but they can also be about policy change, about programming, about new partnerships created and new initiatives. So, you know, many of us work for NGOs. We might not be able to make a financial pledge, but we can probably make some kind of programmatic pledge about the numbers of refugees we hope to reach with quality education, or new partnerships that we're creating with others to, you know, deliver change for refugees. And pledges can come from a wide variety of stakeholders, as I've already mentioned. And the table below just gives a bit of an indication about how the pledging framework actually works. And also, and it's just an example. So the pledging framework has, as I mentioned before, sections on inclusion, on tertiary, and on education emergencies. And there are potential pledging areas under each of those, and they've been allocated per stakeholder group. So, for example, if you're looking to see how you can advocate to your host, if you're in a refugee hosting state and you want to focus on advocacy targeted at your government, then you can look at different sections in the framework and look at the types of pledges that are already listed there as examples, and think about whether they're relevant in your context, and maybe come up with a strategy, an advocacy strategy, to try and get your government to implement that pledge. So for example, here there's some pledges, potential pledging areas around primary and secondary education. So the example here for refugee hosting governments is that they can make a pledge to establish dedicated policy regarding refugee inclusive national education systems, and that guides national, district and local authorities, as well as humanitarian and development action during emergencies. So that's just one kind of potential pledge that a refugee hosting government could make. But in the framework itself, you'll see there's many other kinds of pledges that are given as examples. And then going below, you can see there's other potential pledges for other kinds of stakeholder groups, including financial partners, INGOs, and regional and intergovernmental groupings. So I would really encourage everyone to look out for that global pledging framework that's going to come out in the next few weeks. Use that to assess the refugee education needs in your context and think about the kind of advocacy you could do to really highlight some of the kind of needs that are there and the kinds of pledges that your government could make, or you could make, or other financial partners working in your context could make. Save the Children is definitely going to be doing a lot of this over the next few months, and we'll be looking to work with lots of partners to help amplify that advocacy and trying to get so much support for refugee education at the forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of the presenters today. It's now time for questions and comments. We're not going anywhere for the next 30 minutes, so there's a chance for any of you to chip in, make a suggestion, a comment, a query to any of the presenters. We do have one or two questions that have already come through on the chat, and I think we should start with that because Sian has asked a question of how people with disabilities are included within this advocacy. And I think to possibly reword the question to any of you presenters would be to think about with does advocacy for education for refugees overlap with different sectors that are related to education in many different ways.
I can jump in to try and answer that one. Thanks, Sian, for that question. So one of the, as we've been developing this global framework for refugee education, there is a group of the Co-Sponsorship Alliance who's really been looking at inclusion for refugees who may be more marginalised than others, so particularly education for girls, but also education for disabled refugees. And so there is a whole section in the framework that looks at the kinds of pledging that should be made in those areas. So there's definitely been a lot of interest in how to support education for disabled refugees. And I think I'd really encourage you and others really interested in this area to look at that section and to think about how best you can use that for advocacy. I think there's lots of different examples of the kinds of pledges that can be made, as well as some key messages as well.
Just to jump on to that question and how we're including persons with disabilities when it comes to advocacy. I can give you a practical example. I'm part of not a council, more like a CBO, a community-based organization that was formed by students who are tertiary students who are beneficiary of the Duffy scholarship. So what we always do, what we still do is that we also have students with disabilities. So whenever I need any message, maybe to just use it in my advocacy, then I also make sure to represent their views, because I think sometimes we leave them outside not getting their views. But we are also really pushing hard to ensure that in whatever discussion, even in the GRF, we would have people with disability as part of the panel discussion, because we don't want to speak for them. We want them to actually be there and speak for themselves. So that, for me, is how I make sure I include the views of people with disability when I am doing my advocacy. First, to consult with them, and also to fight for spaces to include them.
And also, maybe just to add to what the previous presenters have said, I mean, this is a very important part about looking at inclusion, that it's not just about the type of schools, but it's about having equal access and looking at the policies in countries. So having advocacy messages about looking at whether refugees are disabled refugees particularly, are able to access services on the same levels or the same terms and the same conditions as host country nationals who have disabilities. So if I take the example of one of the countries, in Turkey, there were certain services that were available to disabled host country nationals in terms of accessing education and the extra support that they could receive. However, often refugees had to pay for those services. So this would be a key point for advocacy, to make sure that there's equitable access to services. So certainly persons with disabilities are not excluded from this and are a key point for a coalescence of advocacy messages. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And we have one from Cinder saying, to what extent can the Global Compact and the Global Framework for Refugee Education be used in the case of a country having high numbers of IDPs?
In terms of the framework and the policy and the policy framework on Refugee Education 2030, IDPs are one of the groups that are considered. So that strategy looks at the needs of refugees, returnees, stateless persons, as well as IDPs, and has certain actions set out for them. There are different policy and legal frameworks covering refugees and IDPs, but I think many of the core messages, many of the core strategies around looking at sustainability, around the permanence of education, the quality of education for IDPs, even if structurally those policies are structurally the frameworks and the legal frameworks are not the same. States have the primary responsibility for providing for IDPs, the hosting state, or the country that people are from, that they are citizens of. But many of the concepts that are in these advocacy documents can equally be applied to IDPs. And often what we are seeing is in countries that are both IDP, countries with high numbers of IDPs as well as refugee hosting countries, is that the coordination structures that are advocating with the government, with the ministries of education, and also having relationships with the development actors. It's about coming together and having the common framework. And in fact, here the SDGs play a really important role because they cover the needs of all the people in a particular country, not determined by nationality or status.
Thank you. We have a question from Yasmina, who asks, how do you recommend we proceed in terms of education for refugee children who are unable to access the public school systems? How do we ensure that they have access to quality education in the interim? And I think I can have a go at responding to part of that in the sense that all these different advocacy campaigns that have been going on, including the Global Compact, which includes declarations from different states, governments, as well as other organizations, are getting closer to this objective, and the idea of inclusion, as we've seen particularly in the Global Refugee Forum, is very central. But I think one of the comments that Emma mentioned in particular was looking at the pillars of accountability, that we can now use these agreements and this consensus to hold governments to account or whole systems to account. But how about the second part of that question for any of you presenters? In the meantime, particularly where there might be a state that might have signed up to the Global Compact, but where on the ground it's not yet happening, how do we ensure that in the interim quality education is still delivered?
So does anybody want to take that, or I'm happy to go after you?
I don't mind. You go ahead first, Jennifer, and I'll jump in if there's anything more I wanted to say.
Okay, maybe just to say, I mean, what we advise in terms of the strategy is that in those countries where access to the national system isn't possible, and some form of education needs to be provided in the interim, is to really look at how to align what is provided, if it's non-formal education, if it's accelerated education, how to make that as closely aligned with what is in the national curriculum of that country, so that at the point when the policy changes, that facilitation, that movement into the national schools is as easy and as seamless as possible, so that people are well prepared. So if it's, for example, language classes, to be prepared for access to to the national schools when maybe there is a policy shift, or accelerated education programs that are structured around the same competencies and the same learning outcomes as are in the national curriculum and in the same sequencing. This is a way of ensuring that level of quality. But at the same time, it's really about trying to find the advocacy to make sure that whatever is provided is recognized and will actually be a platform and facilitate access in the long term. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that actually leads in quite well to a question/comment from Ndi Kumana from URISE in Kakuma, talking about how there are often interim challenges along the way in terms of accessing national systems. For example, refugees from Francophone countries coming to East Africa, in this case, will struggle with language barriers. So even if the policy might be there, there might also be other steps needed before real inclusion can happen. So I think that was more of a comment, which was very pertinent than a question. Just looking through for another question that's coming in, and if any of you prefer to ask your questions verbally, that's also fine. So just unmute yourself at a time when the next person finishes answering, and you can chip in. We have a comment from Matthias Honore. In the settlement, where we implemented adult education, language and literacy, as well as computer courses, after the first and the second graduation, we're sending them with a spirit of volunteering with mobile library and language and literacy to the ones who are unable to access school due to age, distance, and vulnerability. So again, I think this was a comment, and it's, I think I know where this case is in Southwest Uganda. A comment I'd like to add to that, I think, which from the presentations, is that there could be a different stakeholder, could be refugee-led organizations, the type of pledges that they can make towards this as well. It's something that I don't know if there's still time to put that in the framework, but there's organizations like this of Matthias's who are also contributing towards these pledges in very tangible ways. And yeah.
I just wanted to maybe just add a comment when it comes to the sort of pledges also I think refugee youth can also do in making sure we actually achieve we achieve the 15% by 2030. I think what I've also seen with some young people in Nairobi and also from in Uganda and the rest, what they've also done is that sometimes it's not a financial pledge that is needed, it's more of the expertise and experience plus the skill. So what I've also seen is that young people who are already going to university are volunteering to actually teach other people. Like back in Kakuma, I know the folks already in university are going back now to teach the others who are in primary and secondary school, and the ones who are also who haven't had access, rather adult, we call them the adult literacy program. Others are already now also volunteering and taking part in teaching them through the same curriculum they've gone through. So I think also when it comes to the GRF and good practices, that's also something that is very practical that I have personally done, that other young people are also doing, whereby you don't have funding to support it, but you still have expertise and skill. But then for this to also be successful, there needs to be a framework, or rather, how do we actually create these spaces where young people can actually come and offer these particular skills and the experience they already have? So that is something that we also need to consider.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. I think the great thing with this framework is that it's designed to be inclusive to, as you say, embrace different voices, and it's still very much an open process. This is ongoing. We've still got over almost 2 months until the Global Refugee Forum, but that's only the start. in many ways of this conversation ongoing. I think what we'd like to get across through this webinar is that everyone's input is still can still be taken on and is very valuable at this point. There's multiple ways that you can contribute, and even if you just start by looking at the website for the Global Refugee Forum, there are examples of that. Maybe Emma might not want to share more, but I think she's already given a few examples, and the questions that are on this slide at the moment also could prompt you to think about ways that you could contribute and be part of that conversation.
Hi, Edmund. I just thought I'd just come in here with an example of an education and emergencies working group who I know are kind of coordinating efforts around their own pledges, and that's in Uganda. So I know that the group working there, which is similar to the group that the other Edmund was talking about earlier, it's a collection of local and INGOs working in education and emergencies, frequently in districts that host refugees. And they obviously have programming there, but they're also looking at advocacy as well. So what they've been doing is two-pronged. Firstly, they've been looking at the draft pledges that the Ugandan government has been working up for the forum, which I think are mainly around policy and implementation of those policies. And the second thing they've been doing is actually looking at what kinds of pledges the group itself can be making, either kind of as individual organizations, but I think also as a collective group, what they can be doing. So again, I think it's around programmatic initiatives or partnerships or so on, and across the range of different areas like ECD, primary, secondary, but also psychosocial support, teachers. So there's a whole range of different things that they're looking at to make pledges on. And I'm sure that kind of effort could be replicated, or may already be replicated in a number of contexts that the participants on this call are working in.
Mm-hmm. One observation I've had from this webinar, it does seem that the momentum is moving forward in a positive way. I think it's important to point out, and Jennifer did allude to this at the beginning of the webinar, that there's still a long way to go, but also that there are certain contexts where advocacy is still proving challenging. I don't want to mention specific examples now, but I think there might be an impression from these presentations that advocacy always works, and it doesn't. Sometimes I think the example of assistance is a good one. There are times where advocacy efforts can fail time and time again, and that's still the case in parts of the world. But I do have a question for any of the presenters, because it could be relevant to all of you, maybe even also for the Kenya case study. Why is this possible now? All of these things that have happened in the last few years, what are some of the factors that have made it possible for these steps forward to be made versus, say, 15, 20 years ago in terms of refugee education? And what do you think might be behind the possibility of this progress? I mean, maybe I could actually ask specifically first to Mercy, if she's on, or Edmund Langat, about how do you think the guidelines in Kenya it was a project that was possible, in the last few years versus many years before?
I think with increased refugee populations in the Nairobi, and as well as Kenya is a signatory to various international commitments. And so with that, especially the CRRF and what is commonly referred to as the Djibouti Declaration, Kenya is committed a lot more at the moment to fulfilling that. And so they are moving very closely to having that as part of fulfilling their commitment. And that's why now the move is very fast at this point and time to make sure that they are delivering what they have already promised.
Okay.
Yeah.
How does that reflect? Clearly, what you're saying is that it's being leveraged off those declarations. But I wonder, what was it that, I don't know, Emma or Jennifer or anyone, why has there been such a delay given that there have been displacement crises for decades in these advocacy campaigns working, and why is it now that this progress can be made?
I think one of the ways that this has come about, particularly the New York Declaration to begin with, is actually a bit of a cynical one, in that during that time, well, June 2016, there was quite a lot of movements of refugees from the Middle East into Europe, and there was this discussion around a European refugee crisis. And I think there was a lot more interest from European countries and also perhaps the United States looking at the border with on the southern border there. And I think a lot more kind of pressure put on politicians to be thinking about this, although recognizing that the numbers of refugees in those cases isn't anywhere near as large as it has been in parts of Africa or Asia and so on. I think there was some kind of pressure put on politicians to think about this quite critically at that time around 2016 when the New York Declaration was kind of created. But I think it was still, the politicians at that time were still kind of positive towards refugees than they are now in a way. And I think, you know, INGOs and refugees themselves spoke very powerfully about their needs during that time, and so we were able to kind of influence those declarations and ensure that they were kind of as strong as they could be. But I do think some of the emphasis around why those kind of agreements were started was perhaps because of the pressure put on politicians by people who were worried about kind of you know, refugees potentially come closer to their area.
I think also, in addition to the overall political context, we'd also had the World Humanitarian Summit. I think there's also been increased concerns about the impact of short-term humanitarian assistance and how that really affects countries. How does it really assist countries? Is it really making a difference? Are there better ways to do business? So I think there's also been a moment in that we're experiencing now where people are being reflective, where they're also looking at, can we do things better? So that there are a number of factors that I think are coalescing, that are bringing us to a point where we can have some of these discussions and where those commitments were possible. So I think there are a range of factors that have made it possible and sort of given the leverage for us to be able to engage in this kind of advocacy right now. And I think just the scale and the sheer numbers and the fact that not only was there the refugee movement in Europe that caught people's attention, but the Syria crisis and the scale and the duration of a crisis like that, and people sort of seeing that refugee movements are not short-lived, that they are happening on scale. And now we also have the Venezuela situation with 4.5 million refugees in South America. That really this is in a lot of people's consciousness, and there's these crises and these mass movements of people have really galvanized action on a political but also on a civil society level to be thinking about these issues. And I also think people are realizing that not having access to the national systems is actually detrimental in the long term, and that you also have to look at the social issues and the social consequences of people not having education, not having recognized skills, not eventually being able to work, or the marginalization and ghettoization of refugee communities, and the overall impact that has. So I think all of these factors have been enablers to having these conversations.
And I think, yeah, picking up from Jennifer.
Okay, go on, Mercy.
Yeah, picking up from Jennifer, I think including refugees in the national education systems is even more sustainable, in my opinion. Looking at in terms of funding and continuity, when you compare it to maybe having their own separate way of providing them education. So I think it's a more sustainable way of ensuring that refugees have quality education, because it's more affordable, it's more easy, you can easily get quality education through the national systems, other than when you try to provide education on a parallel system.
Bonnie, do you want to contribute to that?
Hello?
I mean, maybe also Jennifer, during your
Hello?
career. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Oh yeah, I was saying, I think for me there are two general things that I look at when in regards to the question you've asked. First of all, I think there's also been there's been a realization among the refugee community, or and they've really been speaking up about what is it that they actually need as compared to what was being provided. So I think that has also brought to attention this particular theme, education, because people are looking at it as something that is very, it's kind of like a basic, it's actually a basic right. So I think that realization has really brought forward that attention being paid to it. The other one, I look at it as when I think about education, I think about it as a main factor to sustainability, to self-reliance, and also to the development of the countries of origin. I think also that's why probably most people are now looking at it keenly, because it kind of brings about how sustainable is this solution. Because when you have that education, you when people volunteer to go back home, they wouldn't be going back home to a situation that they can't get themselves out of. So I think that for me has been also very key. And then there's also been support and rally from different civil society, and they've been calling for the voices of refugees to take part in this discussion. And I think the action of the advocacy in itself for refugees to take part in this discussion is what is also bringing so much attention to knowing that we need to do things a bit better than how we would traditionally do it.
Sure. Yeah, no, I also get the sense that education has taken more of a center stage within the humanitarian response in the last 10 or 20 years. And I think INEE is a manifestation of that, but it also contributed to that as well. And I think the reasons you gave there, Fonny, explain why there has been more of a focus on education, why there should continue to be even more so. I wonder if we have any other questions from the participants. If anyone would like to ask a question verbally or through the chat, you'd be welcome to do so now. If not, we are coming to the end of the webinar now, and unless there are any other contributions anyone would like to make, do continue to refer to the questions on this slide here and to think about how you can remain involved. We're very grateful to all of you for joining us today on the webinar. As mentioned, this has been recorded, so please do share it afterwards, and we look forward to being in touch with all of you soon. Other than that, just to say thanks, and we will be ending the recording and stopping the webinar in the next few minutes, unless there are any last questions. Okay, well, thanks again, presenters, and that's it.